Have you ever tried to take field notes on multiple participants? How do you manage that? In today's video, I'm going to show you a great way to get that done. All right, so let's talk about how you take field notes on multiple participants. Now, following one person and taking field notes on them is easy, and I would even argue that in a very confined, constrained setting, following two people and taking field notes on them is pretty easy. But if you ever try to follow more than that, right, it gets really jumbled and it can get really hard, and your attention just gets diverted in a lot of ways, and you end up with field notes that aren't necessarily valid or reliable or necessarily very thorough, and you're missing stuff from some of your key participants, all right? But there is a way to do this, and I'm going to talk to you about that. So several years ago, I did a year-long case study in a classroom. It was an 8th grade English classroom. So the context is bound, right? Everybody's in that same shared space. I followed one classroom teacher, and then I had 5 focal students in her class, right? So that's 6 people total. How did I manage all of that? Okay, so there are some things here that I did that made this a lot easier and resulted in a lot more valid and reliable data than if I tried to consistently follow 6 people every time I showed up. So the first thing is I was in that classroom 3 days a week. So class was about an hour long, right? So I'm spending 3 hours a week in that context. You should know that from the start, okay? Depending on your situation, you may want to spend more or less time, right, to get, accomplish your goals. Now, there were some things that were consistent no matter what. So the first thing that was consistent is I always documented what the teacher did. So the teacher was observed closely at every single visit, and this was important because this research study was documenting, right, a particular instructional technique that the teacher was implementing. So it was very important that when I was there, I documented the instruction, the things that the teacher was doing and saying, etc. So I always recorded what was happening in the class and what the teacher said or did as it related to the research question, because sometimes the teacher was saying or doing things that needed to be done, of course, but that had nothing to do with my research question. So in those cases, I might document, hey, from 1 o'clock to 1:05, right, the teacher was reviewing the homework for tomorrow or whatever, right? Just so I knew when I looked at those notes what was happening in that time, but I didn't need to really write down what the teacher was, explaining or doing unless it related to the question. Okay, so when the teacher was conducting things with the entire class, I always documented everything that she said, again, as it related to the research question in regards to the entire class. And then I always documented everything the teacher said or did as it related to each individual focal student. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you how I went about deciding how I was going to pay attention to the focal students. And I didn't pay attention closely to every focal student every day. That's not possible, right? Because as I said earlier, that's going to divert my attention and I'm going to end up with a really weak set of field notes. So there is definitely going to be some give and take here. But right, if the teacher called on a particular focal student, even if I wasn't paying close attention to that student that day, I absolutely documented that and wrote down that interaction. So I documented everything the teacher said as it related or did with each individual focal student as much as I could manage that. And I was pretty good about being able to manage that. Now, I did not document what the teacher said and did with individual students who were not focal students, okay? Because that didn't tie back to my research question, so I could just let that go, all right? Now, for the focal students, it's not possible, as I was saying, to closely follow what 5 students are saying and doing at once. It's a little easier in a whole class context, right? Because everybody's sitting there with the teacher at the front and people are raising their hands. And so that, in that regard, that's very easy to do. But what happens when the teacher puts them in small groups or sends them off to work on their own and kids kind of scatter and start going in multiple directions? Then I can't follow what 5 kids are doing, right? Then it's not possible. But I did decide that it was possible during a given observation for me to very carefully and closely follow 2, all right? So I came up with the following system. I'm going to show you this, I'm going to show you what this looks like and how I decided who I was going to document in a minute. But I think just to reiterate, I could always document what any focal student said within the context of a whole class discussion or a whole class lesson, right? And then with this documentation that I'm going to show you, right, I'm following two students more carefully when we go into things like group work, individual assignments, anytime students were going off in multiple directions. And I came up with a rotating system, and let me show you what that looks like. All right, so let me show you my observation schedule. So you'll see here in the far left column, I've got 5 students. I just made those names up off the top of my head. And then you'll see the rotation schedule for how I decide who I'm going to focus on. So you'll see that for observation number 1, Chloe and Jason are paired together. Now, when I'm in this classroom and the teacher is doing a whole class lesson, maybe we're having a whole class discussion about something they read the night before, I'm going to be paying attention to all 5 of these kids, right? So even though Samantha, Nathan, and Jenny aren't checked off, if one of them raises their hand or is called on, I'm going to document that interaction. I'm going to document what happens. Unless it doesn't relate to the research question. Always remember that the research question is king here, right? Okay, but I'm going to follow Chloe and Jason closely. So as soon as they go off to work on their own or they're in small groups, I'm going to be following them around. And then you can see observation 2 is Samantha and Nathan. Then we get to Jenny for observation 3, and there's not 6 kids, so I cycle back up and I'm pairing with Chloe. And then you can see that the next time in observation 4, when I'm observing Jason, he's paired with Samantha. And then when we get to observation 5, Jenny is now paired with Nathan. So as I go through this, right, different kids are not always paired up the same pairings don't always exist, right? And that's really nice for a few reasons. One, it breaks up the pattern, right? It's easy if I always observe Chloe and Jason together for an entire year, off and on, then I'm going to get stuck in a rut and a routine, and it's really easy for me to sort of get used to things and miss things. But because I'm breaking up who these kids are paired with, each of these kids is going to have their own distinct personality and way of interacting and being, and pairing them with other kids throughout the course of this study really just allowed me to not get stuck in a rut in terms of how I think about doing my observations. So that's why I did it this way. Now, obviously you can say, hey, if you're paying attention to Chloe and Jason, you're not paying careful attention to Samantha, Nathan, and Jenny. Aren't I missing important things? Perhaps. And honestly, if I saw something super important happening with Jenny, for example, even though it's not her, turn to be focused on, of course, I'm going to write it down if I can make that happen. But here's the thing. I had 60 observations over about an 8-month period. I was in that class 2 to 3 times a week. So over time, this is all going to pan out, right? Over time, patterns that emerge in, let's say, a whole class context for me, I'm also going to start having patterns emerge in these more individual, small group, right, one-on-one kind of things. You just have to give it not just time in the sense of hours there, because it's not like saying, let's just go in 60 hours. Any 60 hours is fine, right? Do it over 2 months or something like that. But I think this fact that it lasted about 8 months, right? So I had time to really get in there and see how kids were doing things. That really contributed to making really a nice, thick description of valid and reliable information. All right, so there you've got it. That's how I think about incorporating observations with multiple focal students, right? Multiple focal participants in my field observations. What about this? How do you approach doing this? What questions do you have? Head on down to the comments and let's talk about how you think about engaging and setting up observational schedules when you've got more than 2 participants. I'd love to hear your tips, tricks, and your questions.